He was the phantom of the Chicago underworld, a man who painted the streets in violence and never left a trace behind. They called Dominic Moretti a monster, a kingpin utterly incapable of a single human emotion. But when a 4-year-old boy in a faded diner pointed a sticky finger at him and yelled, "Mama, the scary man is crying," the ruthless boss's world completely shattered. He didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he dropped straight to his knees. The rain in Evanston, Illinois, rarely felt cleansing. On a Tuesday afternoon in late October, it felt more like a shroud casting a slate-gray gloom over the sleepy suburban streets. Madeline Hayes stood behind the scratched laminate counter of Patsy's Comfort Kitchen, a damp rag in her hand, wiping away the remnants of a cherry pie from a cracked ceramic saucer. The diner smelled eternally of scorched coffee and fried onions, an aroma that had embedded itself into her pores over the last 4 years. Vroom, vroom, the fire truck is coming. Madeline's lips curved into a soft, tired smile. She glanced over her shoulder toward the corner booth, the one furthest from the glass windows. There, her 4-year-old son Leo was violently crashing a plastic red fire engine into a fortress made of empty sugar packets. His dark, unruly curls bounced with every animated movement, and his striking, icy blue eyes that belonged to a ghost, were narrowed in deep concentration. "Careful with the city, Chief Leo!" Madeline called out, her voice gentle but strained. "The mayor won't be happy if you knock down the sugar packet bank." "It's an emergency, Mama," Leo declared, his chubby hand sweeping 3 packets onto the checkered linoleum floor. Madeline shook her head affectionately, tucking a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear. She was exhausted. The double shifts were taking their toll, but she was invisible here. A single mother scraping by in a town where nobody asked questions. It was safe. It was necessary. Above the heavy oak door of the diner, the brass bell chimed. It was a sharp, jarring sound that somehow managed to slice through the low ambient hum of the ancient refrigerator. Madeline didn't look up immediately. "Just a second, I'll be right with—" The words died in her throat. The temperature in the diner seemed to plummet, a sudden suffocating chill wrapping around her lungs. 2 men had stepped over the threshold. They did not belong in Patsy's Comfort Kitchen. They did not belong in Evanston. The man in the rear was built like a freight train, a hulking mass of muscle poured into a tailored dark suit. But it was the man in front who made the blood drain from Madeline's face, leaving her as pale as paper. Dominic Moretti. He stood at 6'3", a monolith of terrifying grace and tailored Italian wool. His dark hair was perfectly styled, save for a single lock that fell over a face carved from marble and hardened by unspeakable violence. He wore a charcoal black overcoat, the shoulders dusted with rain. His presence alone seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Old Man Henderson, the diner's owner who had been dozing by the register, woke up with a start and shrank back against the wall, trembling visibly. Dominic was known in the whispers of the underworld as the Butcher of the Gold Coast. He was not a man who visited diners. He was a man who ordered them burned to the ground. Madeline's hands began to shake so violently she dropped the damp rag. It hit the floor with a wet slap. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to dive over the counter, grab Leo, and flee through the kitchen's back exit. But her legs had turned to lead. Dominic's cold obsidian gaze swept the room, dismissive and bored, until his eyes locked onto the woman behind the counter. For a span of 5 seconds, absolute silence reigned. Dominic's breathing stopped. The indifferent, lethal mask he had worn for the past half-decade cracked, fracturing down the middle. His jaw went slack, and he took a single faltering step backward, colliding with his enforcer, Vincent. "Boss!" Vincent rumbled, confused by the sudden stumble of a man who never showed weakness. Dominic didn't hear him. He couldn't hear anything over the roaring in his ears. His chest heaved, a ragged gasp tearing through his throat. He was hallucinating. He had to be. The The woman standing 10 feet away from him wearing a stained pink waitress apron had been dead for 5 years. He had scooped the ashes from her ruined apartment with his bare, bleeding hands. He had stood over a closed casket, empty save for a few charred belongings, and buried his soul right next to it. Yet here she was, Madeline. His Madeline. A single hot tear breached the barricade of Dominic's lashes, tracing a jagged path down his sharply defined cheekbone. Then came another. And another. The ruthless mafia boss, a man who had tortured rivals without blinking, was weeping silently in the middle of a linoleum-floored diner. In the corner booth, the plastic fire engine skidded to a halt. Leo had stopped playing. The little boy stood up on the vinyl bench, his wide, icy blue eyes fixed on the giant man in the doorway. Leo raised a sticky, jam-covered finger, pointing directly at the towering mobster. "Mama!" Leo's high-pitched voice shattered the heavy silence echoing off the diner walls. "The scary man is crying." Dominic flinched as if he had been shot. His gaze snapped from Madeline to the boy standing in the booth. Dark curls, a fierce, stubborn jawline, icy blue eyes. Dominic's breath hitched. A sound escaped his chest, a guttural broken noise that was half sob, half roar. He didn't think. The tactical brilliance that made him a kingpin evaporated. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. Dominic, no. Madeline shrieked, finally breaking her paralysis. She bolted from behind the counter, throwing herself between the mob boss and her son. But Dominic didn't hurt them. He didn't reach for the heavy-loaded Glock 19 resting in the shoulder holster beneath his coat. Instead, his knees hit the hard linoleum floor with a heavy thud. He wrapped his massive trembling arms around Madeline's waist, burying his face into her stomach, and blindly reached out with one hand to pull the small, bewildered boy into the fray. He hugged them both, his massive shoulders shaking violently as the Phantom of Chicago finally broke down. "Bah! Boss! Boss, what is this?" Vincent's deep voice was laced with utter disbelief. His hand hovered over his own weapon, unsure of what threat had suddenly brought Dominic Moretti to his knees. The enforcer quickly moved to the diner's door, flipping the open sign to closed and turning the deadbolt. "Hey, old man!" Vincent snapped at Henderson. "Take a walk, to the back, now!" Henderson scrambled away, leaving the front of the diner entirely to them. Madeline stood frozen in the cage of Dominic's arms. She could feel the dampness of his tears soaking through her thin uniform. The sheer overwhelming power of the man, the sheer desperation of his grip was suffocating. "Let go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Dominic, please, you're scaring him. You're scaring Leo." At the sound of the boy's name, Dominic slowly pulled his head back. He looked up at Madeline, his eyes bloodshot, searching her face as if memorizing the curve of her jaw, the scattering of freckles across her nose. His large hands, scarred and calloused from years of brutality, moved up to cup her face. "You're alive!" Dominic choked out his voice, a raspy whisper that sounded like grinding stones. "Madeline, mio Dio, you're alive!" He turned his head to look at the boy, who was still clutching Madeline's pant leg, peering cautiously at the weeping giant. Dominic's eyes traced the boy's features. The math was not difficult for a man accustomed to calculating odds. 4 years old. He had known Madeline exactly 5 years ago. 5 years. The memories hit Dominic like a physical blow. 5 years ago, Madeline had been a bright-eyed trauma nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Dominic had been brought in through the underground loading dock, bleeding out from a rival hit, refusing to let the hospital report the gunshot wound to the police. She had stitched him up. She had reprimanded him, scolding the terrifying underworld air as if he were a reckless teenager. He had been captivated. For 6 months, they had a secret, burning romance. Dominic kept his true nature hidden as best he could, playing the role of a wealthy businessman. But the truth always bleeds through. When she finally discovered the monster he was, she had tried to pull away. He hadn't let her. He had sworn to protect her. Then came the night the sky turned orange. I thought you burned, Dominic said, his voice dropping into a dangerous feral register. He stood up slowly, towering over them once again. The tears on his face were drying, replaced rapidly by a terrifying, possessive intensity. Your apartment in Little Italy. It was rigged with C4. I watched the fire department pull out a body. They said it was you. Madeline swallowed hard, stepping backward and pulling Leo behind her legs. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Gable. She'd come over to borrow some tea. I'd gone down to the corner store for milk. Dominic's chest expanded as he took a deep, stabilizing breath. For 5 years, the guilt of her supposed death had been the fuel for his ascension. He had believed Lorenzo Conti, his greatest rival, had ordered the hit to punish him. In a blind, grief-stricken rage, Dominic had orchestrated a massacre. He wiped the entire Conti family off the map in a week of unprecedented bloodshed, cementing his reputation as the butcher. He had sacrificed his humanity on the altar of her grave. And you never came to me, Dominic said the words, slicing through the air like a blade. You watched the news. You saw me bury an empty casket. You saw me turn the city into a graveyard for you, and you stayed dead. I had to, Madeline cried out, tears finally spilling over her own cheeks. Look at you, Dominic. Look at the men you travel with. Look at the blood on your hands. I was pregnant. I couldn't bring a child into a world where people blow up buildings just to send a message. He is my son. Dominic snarled, the raw volume of his voice making Leo flinch. Dominic instantly softened, dropping his gaze. I'm sorry, Piccolo. I won't yell. He looked back at Madeline, his jaw ticking. He is my blood, Madeline. You stole 5 years from me. You stole his first steps, his first words. I saved his life. Madeline shot back, her maternal instinct overpowering her terror. If I had stayed, whoever tried to kill me would have finished the job, and they wouldn't have spared a baby. Dominic's eyes darkened, turning completely black. Lorenzo Conti has been dead for 4.5 years. I made sure of it. You were safe. You should have come home. Madeline shook her head slowly, a bitter, tragic laugh escaping her lips. Dominic, it wasn't Lorenzo Conti. The diner went dead silent. Even Vincent, standing guard by the door, turned his head sharply. What are you talking about? Dominic demanded, his voice dangerously low. The night of the fire. Madeline whispered, her hands gripping Leo's small shoulders. Before I went to the store, I got a phone call on the landline. The man told me to leave the city immediately, or the next bomb wouldn't be in my living room. It would be in the hospital nursery where I worked. He told me that a mob boss cannot have a weakness, and that an unborn bastard child would only ruin the empire. Dominic stepped forward, crowding her space, his presence overwhelming. Who called you Madeline? Give me the name. She looked up into the furious eyes of the man she had once loved, perhaps still loved in the darkest, most broken corner of her heart. It was Carmine, she breathed. It was your Uncle Carmine. If a man's soul could audibly shatter, it happened in that exact moment. Carmine Moretti, his father's brother. The man who had trained Dominic to shoot his first gun. The man who had placed the heavy gold ring of the syndicate onto Dominic's finger when he ascended to the head of the table. Carmine had consoled Dominic at Madeline's funeral, handing him a stiff drink and telling him that grief makes a man lethal, and a lethal man rules the world. Carmine. Dominic repeated the name, tasting like ash and poison in his mouth. He said you were getting too soft. Madeline continued the dam breaking now that the truth was out. He said you were planning to leave the family for me. He told me that if I didn't disappear, he would hunt me to the ends of the earth. When the bomb went off 10 minutes later, I knew he wasn't bluffing. So I ran. I took the cash, I'd caught a Greyhound bus and changed my name. I did it to keep Leo alive. I did it to keep you alive, Dominic. If you had known Carmine did it, you would have gone to war against your own family. They would have killed you. Dominic stood perfectly still. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was a living, breathing entity in the room. He had slaughtered the Conti family for a crime they hadn't committed. He had lived in an agonizing hollow shell of existence, mourning a woman who was hiding in a diner just 30 miles away, all because of his uncle's ambition. Vincent cleared his throat nervously from the door. Boss, if what she's saying is true, oh. It's true, Dominic said softly. There was no rage in his voice now, only a terrifying, absolute calm. It was the calm before a catastrophic storm. He turned his attention back to Madeline and the little boy who was now clutching his plastic fire truck against his chest, staring at the adults with wide, observant eyes. Dominic knelt down again this time, smoothly, intentionally. He rested on one knee, bringing himself to eye level with Leo. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, solid gold pocket watch, a family heirloom he carried everywhere. He pressed a button, and the lid popped open with a soft click. "Do you like machines, Leo?" Dominic asked, his tone miraculously gentle, completely stripping away the monster that usually resided in his vocal cords. Leo hesitated, glancing up at his mother. Madeline gave a stiff, imperceptible nod. Leo looked back at the watch, mesmerized by the ticking gears. "It's shiny," the boy whispered. "It's yours," Dominic said, placing the heavy gold timepiece into the boy's small hands. "I'm your father, Leo. I know I look a little scary right now, but I promise you on my life, nobody is ever going to scare you again. Not while I have breath in my lungs." Leo looked at the watch, then up at Dominic. "Are you going to take us for a ride in the big black car?" he asked, pointing out the window to the convoy of tinted SUVs parked in the rain. Dominic looked up at Madeline. "Yes," he stated, leaving no room for argument. "We are leaving." Madeline shook her head frantically. "No, Dominic, please. We have a life here. We have a routine. You can't just drag us back into a war zone. If Carmine finds out I'm alive—" "Carmine is a dead man," Dominic interrupted, standing up. The absolute certainty in his voice made Madeline's blood run cold. "He has been a dead man walking for 5 years. He just didn't know it yet. But you are not staying here, Madeline. You are entirely exposed. Any low-level street soldier could walk in here for a cup of coffee and recognize you. You are coming with me to the city, to my penthouse. It is impenetrable." "I am not letting my son grow up around guns and blood," Madeline shouted, stepping forward, pressing her hands against Dominic's chest. The solid wall of muscle didn't budge an inch. "He will grow up in a fortress," Dominic replied, looking down at her hands, feeling the heat of her touch through his shirt. It was a sensation he had craved every night in his nightmares. "He will grow up like a prince. He will never touch a weapon if you don't want him to. But you are mine, Madeline, and he is mine. I lost you both once to a lie. I will burn Chicago to the ground a second time before I let you out of my sight again." Madeline saw the unyielding resolve in his blue eyes. It was the same stubbornness she saw in Leo every single day. She knew there was no fighting him on this. Dominic Moretti did not ask for permission. He conquered. "Vinny," Dominic called out over his shoulder, not breaking eye contact with Madeline. "Get the cars ready. Have Marcus and the perimeter team sweep the alleyway. Nobody gets within 100 feet of them." "On it, boss," Vincent replied, tapping his earpiece and pushing the diner doors open, stepping out into the pouring rain. Dominic gently reached out, intertwining his fingers with Madeline's. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. "Grab your coats," he murmured, his voice softening just for her. "The ghost of Madeline Hayes is dead, and the butcher of Chicago has a score to settle." Madeline gripped Leo's hand tightly, pulling him toward the back room to grab their belongings. As she looked back at Dominic standing amidst the faded diner booths, she realized with terrifying clarity the quiet, safe life she had built was over. The underworld had come to claim them, and the streets of Chicago were about to run red once more. The relentless driving rain battered the heavily tinted bulletproof glass of the Cadillac Escalade, obscuring the dreary gray suburban landscape of Evanston as the heavily armed convoy sped rapidly toward the towering, jagged skyline of Chicago. Inside the cavernous, luxurious cabin of the SUV, the silence was absolute and suffocating, heavy with the suffocating weight of entirely unsaid words and 5 excruciating years of agonizing necessary deception. Madeline sat stiffly against the pristine black leather upholstery, her slender arms wrapped fiercely and protectively around Leo, who had finally succumbed to the overwhelming exhaustion of the day's events. The rhythmic, soothing hum of the massive engine had lulled the little boy into a deep sleep, his unruly dark curls resting peacefully against her chest. The heavy golden pocket watch still clutched tightly in his small, sticky fist. Dominic sat directly across from them, occupying the rear-facing seat, his massive tailored frame radiating an intense, deeply suppressed kinetic energy that made the air in the vehicle crackle with tension. He had not taken his piercing, icy blue eyes off them since the convoy violently pulled away from the damp alleyway behind the faded diner. He watched the gentle rhythmic rise and fall of his young son's chest with a profound reverence bordering on religious devotion, his sharp gaze tracing the innocent features of the child he had never known existed. Every few minutes his strong, angular jaw would clench tightly, the formidable muscles ticking visibly beneath his bruised olive skin as the horrific reality of Carmine's ultimate betrayal washed over him afresh. The man who had carefully mentored him, who had toasted with expensive champagne at his table, had coldly orchestrated the greatest tragedy of his entire life. "You do not need to look at us like we are ghosts." "Dominic," Madeline finally whispered, her trembling voice, barely carrying over the low, constant hum of the heavy tires, completely gripping the wet asphalt. She shifted her weight nervously, trying to ease the painful stiffness radiating through her lower back. "We are real. We are here." Dominic leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows heavily on his knees, his large, scarred hands clasped loosely together in quiet contemplation. "I spent nearly 2,000 agonizing nights dreaming desperately about a ghost," he murmured, his voice a gravelly, broken rasp that betrayed his ruthless reputation. "I am simply terrified that if I blink or look away for a single fleeting second, you will both vanish into thin air and leave me in the dark again." The convoy suddenly plunged into the cavernous lower levels of the sprawling city, navigating a secret complex labyrinth of underground concrete tunnels reserved exclusively for the ultra-wealthy and the dangerously powerful elites of the underworld. They bypassed the frustrating, bustling downtown traffic, entirely slipping smoothly beneath a towering glass and steel skyscraper that completely dominated the iconic, magnificent mile. The massive, reinforced steel gates of the subterranean garage groaned open with a heavy metallic screech, instantly recognizing the encrypted digital signal broadcasting from Vincent's lead vehicle. Heavily armed security personnel clad in dark tactical gear and carrying automatic rifles tightly flanked the perimeter. Madeline felt a sudden cold shiver violently run down her delicate spine as the armored SUV finally rolled to a smooth halt. The sheer terrifying scale of Dominic's dark, bloody empire was suddenly overwhelmingly real, stripping away any lingering illusions of a normal life. Vincent swiftly opened the heavy door, offering a deeply respectful, solemn nod to Madeline as she nervously stepped out onto the polished concrete floor, carefully carrying the sleeping child. Dominic was instantly by her side, his imposing, terrifying presence forming a physical, impenetrable shield between his fragile family and the cavernous, heavily guarded garage. "Let me carry him," Dominic offered quietly, gently holding out his massive, calloused arms. Madeline hesitated for a mere fraction of a second, her maternal instincts warring with her undeniable history with the man standing before her, before she gently transferred Leo's warm weight. Dominic took the boy with an incredibly surprising tenderness, carefully cradling his sleeping son against his broad, muscular chest. Leo stirred briefly in the cold air, murmuring a soft, incoherent, sleepy sound, before instinctively burying his small, innocent face deep into the lapel of Dominic's wildly expensive, rain-dampened charcoal wool overcoat. A sleek private elevator requiring both a sophisticated biometric retina scan and a complex 6-digit numerical passcode whisked them upward at a truly dizzying, ear-popping speed. When the brushed steel doors finally parted with a soft chime, Madeline gasped softly in pure astonishment. The penthouse was a sprawling, magnificent masterpiece of modern minimalist architecture, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the storm-swept, glittering city below. The expansive interior was elegantly draped in dark mahogany wood, highly polished white marble floors, and soft ambient recessed lighting. Yet despite the undeniable staggering luxury, it felt remarkably cold and uninviting. It was clearly the lonely residence of a man who lived entirely alone, a beautifully constructed golden mausoleum designed specifically for a ruthless kingpin, passively waiting for his own inevitable violent demise. An older woman with kind, deeply weary eyes and thick silver hair pulled neatly into a severe bun emerged quickly from the shadows of the kitchen hallway. She nervously wiped her hands on a pristine, starched white apron. "Mr. Moretti," she began respectfully, stopping absolutely dead in her tracks as her wide eyes fully registered the strange woman and the sleeping child in her employer's arms. "Rosa Bernio." Dominic spoke softly, stepping fully into the expansive, quiet living room. "This is Madeline, and this is my son Leo. They will be staying here permanently with me. Prepare the secure guest wing immediately. Child-proof the heavy doors, the lower cabinets, and completely lock down the glass balcony doors. Spare absolutely no expense and call Donovan to double the armed security detail downstairs immediately." Rosa's shaking hands flew quickly to her mouth, hot tears instantly welling in her tired eyes as she miraculously recognized Madeline from the framed hidden photographs that had long haunted the boss's private locked study. "By all the holy saints," she whispered breathlessly, rapidly crossing herself hastily in deep reverence. "It is a true blessed miracle from heaven above. Right away, sir. I will prepare everything for the young master and the lady immediately." As Rosa hurried away frantically to carry out her strict orders, Dominic turned slowly to Madeline, his facial expression hardening considerably as the incredibly gentle, loving father gave way rapidly to the ruthless, bloodthirsty kingpin of Chicago. "I must leave the building for a few hours. The perimeter is entirely locked down. Nobody can possibly get up here without my direct personal clearance." Madeline felt a sudden, unexpected spike of sheer panic at the frightening thought of him leaving them alone in this strange place. "Where are you going?" she asked urgently, her trembling fingers nervously twisting the cheap fabric of her stained pink waitress uniform. Dominic gently laid the sleeping peaceful boy down onto the massive soft velvet sofa, carefully covering him with his own heavy warm overcoat. He slowly straightened up meticulously, adjusting his expensive silver cufflinks, his eyes turning a dead, terrifyingly icy blue. "I am forcefully calling a mandatory immediate meeting of the syndicate captains," Dominic stated coldly smoothly, slipping his heavy Glock 19 from its leather shoulder holster to precisely check the loaded chamber. "I am going to look my uncle directly in the eye." "Dominic, wait," Madeline urged, desperately taking a quick step toward him, her heart pounding. "If he even slightly suspects you know the ugly truth, he will definitely strike first. Carmine is a venomous snake. You fiercely said it yourself years ago." Dominic calmly holstered the deadly weapon, his intense gaze lingering softly on her worried face. He slowly reached out his rough knuckles, lightly grazing her soft cheek. "I am the butcher Madeline," he whispered darkly, a terrifyingly dark, hollow smile curving his handsome lips. "I do not fear snakes. I simply sever their heads." Without another single word, he turned sharply and strode powerfully toward the waiting elevator. leaving Madeline standing completely alone in the beautiful golden cage, nervously watching the dark, violent storm clouds gather ominously over the restless city. The secret underground speakeasy known famously as the Velvet Room was completely emptied of its usual vibrant high society clientele. Located deep beneath the bustling, noisy streets of the downtown Loop, the soundproofed establishment served exclusively as the absolute neutral ground for the criminal syndicate's most critical, dangerous meetings. The stale air inside the windowless room was incredibly thick with pungent, expensive cigar smoke and the heavy, sweet scent of aged, top-shelf bourbon. Dominic sat silently at the absolute head of the long-polished mahogany table, his handsome face an impenetrable, terrifying mask of cold stone. Vincent stood perfectly still, silently hiding in the dark shadows directly behind him, his hand resting casually near his concealed weapon. Around the massive table sat 5 hardened captains, arguably the most dangerous, ruthless men in all of Chicago. At the exact opposite end of the table sat Carmine Moretti, smiling warmly and affectionately at his powerful nephew. Carmine was a remarkably distinguished man in his late 60s, possessing a famously silver tongue and a strategic mind as incredibly sharp as a barber's straight razor. He wore a perfectly tailored, expensive pinstripe suit, a vibrant red silk pocket square perfectly folded in his breast pocket, and the heavy, solid gold pinky ring that prominently signified his elite, untouchable status within the criminal family. Dominic, my brilliant boy. Carmine rumbled deeply, his smooth voice dripping with calculated faux affection as he slowly poured himself a large glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Calling a mandatory emergency meeting in the absolute middle of a terrible storm. This must certainly be a matter of grave, unprecedented importance. Has the violent Russian cartel foolishly decided to cause bloody trouble on the South Side again? Dominic stared unblinkingly at the older man, his sharp eyes silently tracing the familiar weathered lines of his beloved uncle's face. He desperately searched for any subtle hint of guilt, any lingering trace of the absolute monster who had mercilessly threatened an unborn child and subsequently blown a residential building to burning pieces. There was absolutely nothing. Carmine was an absolute flawless master of the deceptive mask. No, Uncle Leif. Dominic finally replied, his deep voice eerily, unnervingly calm, resonating loudly through the completely silent room. The volatile Russians are perfectly quiet tonight. This sudden meeting exclusively concerns a vital matter much closer to our own home. It deeply concerns the concept of absolute loyalty. It actively concerns a restless ghost. Carmine took a very slow, measured sip of his strong bourbon, his dark, calculating eyes betraying a momentary microscopic flicker of genuine confusion. A ghost? Carmine chuckled softly, though the forced sound heavily lacked its usual comforting warmth. You speak in strange, cryptic riddles tonight, my dear nephew. Are we foolishly hunting invisible phantoms now? The other 5 dangerous captains shifted uncomfortably in their creaking leather chairs, instantly sensing the sudden, intensely lethal tension aggressively radiating from their terrifying boss. Dominic leaned forward slowly, placing both of his large hands completely flat upon the highly polished wood table. Exactly 5 years ago, the innocent woman I deeply loved burned to unrecognizable ashes in Little Italy. Dominic stated clearly, his voice suddenly dropping to an incredibly dangerous, deadly whisper that chilled the room. I viciously slaughtered the entire Conti family for that unspeakable crime. I completely painted the city streets with their warm blood, and I did it entirely with your enthusiastic vocal blessing. Carmine nodded extremely solemnly, playing the deceptive role of the deeply sympathetic mourning elder statesman flawlessly. It was a truly tragic loss, Dominic. A terrible, crippling blow to your heart. But you did exactly what a strong, feared leader must do. You demonstrated ultimate, unquestionable power to our enemies. You rightfully avenged her pure honor. Dominic's lips curled very slowly into a terrifying, completely humorless smirk. Yes, I thoroughly avenged her. But lately I have been actively thinking about the exact complicated logistics of that fiery night. The hidden bomb was incredibly sophisticated. It absolutely required precise, deadly timing. It inherently required someone who knew exactly where she was located and exactly when she was completely unprotected. It required someone who possessed deep, unrestricted access to my personal, highly private security details. The underground room suddenly plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence. A large, visible bead of nervous sweat quickly formed on the wrinkled brow of Dante, the seasoned captain of the West Side, as he looked anxiously between the two powerful men. Carmine carefully set his crystal glass down very slowly, the warm, fake smile finally dissolving completely from his weathered, deceptive face. What exactly are you baselessly implying, Dominic?" Carmine asked sharply, his voice rapidly hardening into a highly defensive, aggressive edge. "Are you foolishly suggesting that someone within this very secure room, someone entirely within our own loyal family, secretly betrayed you?" Dominic did not even blink. "I am not implying anything whatsoever, Uncle. I am boldly stating a factual, undeniable reality that has very recently come to brilliant light." Dominic stood up incredibly slowly, the sheer imposing size of his muscular frame totally dominating the dimly lit, smoky space. He began to forcefully pace directly behind his tall chair, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly like steel hammer strikes against an iron anvil. "I received entirely new, irrefutable information earlier today, incredibly shocking information. It officially seems the slaughtered Conti family was completely, entirely innocent." Carmine scoffed incredibly loudly, dramatically waving a highly dismissive hand in the stale air. "Absolute nonsense. You are foolishly letting old buried grief completely cloud your otherwise sharp judgment, my boy. The concrete evidence pointed directly and undeniably to Lorenzo Conti. We all clearly saw the police wiretap transcripts." Dominic suddenly stopped pacing. "Transcripts that you personally and generously provided directly to me, Uncle. Transcripts that were expertly, entirely fabricated simply to point me violently in the wrong direction." Carmine aggressively rose from his chair, violently slamming his open palms entirely flat against the hard table. "You actually dare accuse your own loyal blood. I practically raised you from a boy. I proudly put the heavy crown directly upon your head. If you truly have actual proof of this ridiculous offensive treason, present it to the table now, or severely apologize." Dominic stared coldly at the very man who had selfishly ordered his entire family destroyed. The overwhelming, burning urge to instantly pull his concealed weapon and place a hollow-point bullet directly between Carmine's lying eyes was overwhelmingly physically powerful. But he desperately wanted Carmine to truly suffer. He carefully wanted to totally dismantle his treacherous uncle's criminal empire piece by agonizing bloody peace. "I absolutely do not need to present any proof whatsoever to a dead man, Carmine." Carmine sneered darkly, arrogantly, puffing out his tailored chest. "You genuinely think you can just easily kill me? Half the armed men in this entire syndicate answer exclusively to me directly. You hastily pull that trigger and you instantly start a bloody civil war that will completely tear Chicago apart. You are a naive fool, Dominic. You tragically let a dead, forgotten woman make you incredibly soft." Dominic smiled again, a chilling, highly genuine smile that made the hardened Vincent take a subconscious, terrified step backward into the dark shadows. "She is absolutely not dead, Uncle," Dominic whispered incredibly softly, relishing the moment. "She is currently sitting safely in my impenetrable penthouse, comfortably watching my living son." Carmine's face instantly drained of all visible color. his arrogant, confident posture completely and instantly collapsing as the horrifying, impossible truth finally struck him like a physical blow. But the terrible, dramatic twist was absolutely not finished. Before the stunned Carmine could quickly speak, his initial shock entirely vanished, rapidly replaced by a dark, incredibly sinister grin. He reached slowly into his suit pocket and pulled out a cheap plastic burner phone. "Your impenetrable penthouse!" Carmine laughed incredibly cruelly, his voice dripping with venom. "The Golden Fortress. You genuinely, honestly think I didn't extensively plan for this exact impossible scenario? I surprisingly knew she was alive for several months, Dominic. I've just been patiently, quietly waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. Did you really truly think Donovan, your beloved head of security, was entirely loyal to you?" Dominic's blood instantly ran as cold as glacial ice. Donovan, the perimeter guard, the heavily armed man currently protecting Madeline and Leo. Carmine pressed a single glowing button on the plastic phone. "Checkmate, dear nephew," the old man whispered. The tiny, insignificant metallic click of the cheap plastic burner phone echoed through the suffocating silence of the subterranean speakeasy like the deafening toll of a funeral bell. For a fraction of a millisecond, time itself seemed to suspend entirely. Then, the absolute apex predator of the Chicago underworld violently snapped. Dominic Moretti did not scream. He did not hesitate. His massive hand became a blur of lethal practiced motion, crossing his broad chest to draw the heavy Glock 19 from its leather holster with terrifying, blinding speed. Before the arrogant, victorious smile could even fully form upon Carmine's weathered, treacherous face, a deafening gunshot violently ruptured the stale, cigar-choked air of the windowless room. The heavy, hollow-point bullet completely shattered Carmine's right shoulder, violently spinning the older man backward out of his expensive leather chair and sending him crashing heavily onto the polished hardwood floor in a miserable, screaming heap of tailored pinstripes and suddenly blooming crimson blood. Chaos instantly and completely engulfed the velvet room. The 5 hardened captains simultaneously lunged out of their seats, desperately scrambling for cover and reaching frantically for their own concealed weapons, utterly paralyzed by the sudden, unprecedented violence erupting between the royal bloodline of the syndicate. Vincent, entirely anticipating his volatile boss's explosive reaction, had already drawn his twin tactical handguns, leveling them aggressively at the surrounding captains with absolute, unwavering, lethal intent. Nobody moves a single solitary muscle. Vincent roared thunderously, his deep, commanding voice easily drowning out Carmine's pathetic, agonizing shrieks. The very first man to draw a weapon dies instantly with a bullet directly between his eyes. This is family business. Dominic did not spare a single fleeting glance at his bleeding, writhing uncle. His terrifying, icy blue eyes were completely blown wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, an emotion the butcher of Chicago had not genuinely felt in 5 long, bloody years. The golden cage he had so arrogantly designed to protect his fragile, newly discovered family was suddenly transformed into a deadly, inescapable death trap. Donovan, the head of security, the highly trained, heavily armed man who possessed the ultimate unrestricted master access codes to every single reinforced door and private elevator in the entire towering skyscraper. The betrayal was an incredibly deep, catastrophic wound that threatened to completely destroy everything Dominic had miraculously regained. Vincent, keep these pathetic rats locked down. If Carmine bleeds out, let him. Dominic barked savagely, already sprinting powerfully toward the heavy reinforced steel exit doors. He aggressively smashed his large shoulder violently against the thick metal, bursting forcefully out into the dimly lit, damp concrete corridor and sprinting desperately toward the waiting armored escalade. The torrential, unforgiving rain was still furiously battering the city streets above, but the furious, Raging storm outside was absolutely nothing compared to the apocalyptic, terrifying hurricane of pure, unadulterated panic completely consuming his racing heart. Meanwhile, high above the glittering storm-swept city in the sprawling, luxurious, and seemingly impenetrable penthouse, Madeline gently stroked Leo's soft, unruly dark curls as he slept peacefully upon the massive velvet sofa. The heavy, oppressive silence of the expansive apartment was suddenly jarringly broken by the terrifying, unmistakable sound of the private elevator loudly chiming its arrival. Madeline immediately stiffened, her maternal instincts instantly flaring into a state of high, terrifying alert. Dominic had explicitly clearly stated that he was completely locking down the entire perimeter, that absolutely nobody could possibly come up to this secure private floor without his direct personal clearance. The brushed steel doors smoothly and quietly slid open. It was not Dominic. Donovan, a towering, heavily scarred man wearing a pitch-black tactical uniform and a terrifyingly cold, dead expression, stepped slowly into the grand marble-floored foyer. He held a silenced, incredibly lethal submachine gun casually at his side, the deadly dark metal gleaming ominously in the soft ambient recessed lighting. Two more heavily armed, masked rogue mercenaries stepped out entirely silently behind him, fanning out quickly and efficiently into the luxurious living space like hunting wolves smelling fresh, helpless prey. "Where is the boss?" Madeline demanded quickly, her voice trembling slightly, but attempting to project a strong, brave authority. She did not remotely feel her hands instinctively moving to completely shield the sleeping little boy. Donovan slowly raised the heavy, silenced weapon, a sick, twisted smirk slowly creeping across his scarred, rugged face. "The boss is unfortunately heavily delayed, ma'am," he replied coldly, his rough voice dripping with sarcastic, fake politeness. "Carmine sends his absolute warmest regards." Suddenly, Rosa, the sweet elderly housekeeper, bravely emerged forcefully from the adjacent kitchen hallway. She completely understood the terrifying, deadly situation in a singular, horrific heartbeat. With a sudden, astonishing burst of desperate protective courage, the brave old woman grabbed a heavy, solid bronze statue from a nearby decorative pedestal and hurled it violently directly at the traitorous security chief. "Run, Madeline. Take the sweet boy and run to the safe room." Rosa screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, forcefully throwing her frail, aging body directly into the path of the advancing, heavily armed men. The silenced submachine gun violently spat 3 deadly, quiet coughs. Rosa collapsed heavily onto the pristine white marble floor, a tragic, spreading pool of dark red blood instantly staining her starched white apron. A blood-curdling, horrified scream violently ripped from Madeline's throat. The sheer terrifying brutality of the sudden violence instantly shattered her temporary paralysis. She aggressively scooped Leo up into her trembling arms, the little boy waking instantly, crying out loudly in deep confusion and sudden terror as the terrifying, deafening chaos rudely ripped him from his peaceful, sweet dreams. Madeline did not look back. She sprinted frantically, her feet slipping slightly on the highly polished floors, desperately making a mad, panicked dash directly toward the sprawling, heavily reinforced master bedroom suite. She remembered Dominic briefly mentioning a secure panic room hidden somewhere within the expansive walls. Catch the woman! Do not shoot the boy yet! Carmine strictly wants him alive as leverage!" Donovan barked angrily, stepping completely over Rosa's tragic, lifeless body and quickly giving chase down the long, luxurious, shadowy hallway. Madeline aggressively slammed the heavy solid oak bedroom door shut securely behind her, frantically fumbling with the heavy brass locks. Her heart was violently hammering against her delicate ribs, like a trapped, terrified bird desperately trying to escape a terrible cage. She desperately scanned the massive, beautifully decorated room, her panicked wide eyes searching frantically for anything closely resembling a hidden secure door. Her eyes locked instantly onto the massive, walk-in cedar closet. She forcefully dragged Leo inside her trembling hands, desperately pushing aside expensive tailored suits and luxurious silk dresses, searching frantically for a secret hidden panel. There, completely hidden behind a tall, heavy, full-length mirror, was a sleek digital steel keypad. "Mama, I'm incredibly scared." Leo sobbed uncontrollably tightly, clutching the heavy golden pocket watch directly against his small, heaving chest, tears streaming rapidly down his pale face. "I know, baby, I know," Madeline whispered desperately, tears blinding her vision as she frantically pressed random desperate numbers on the glowing keypad. "Just stay completely quiet. Daddy is coming. I promise you, Daddy is coming." The heavy oak door of the bedroom violently splintered outward with a deafening, terrifying crash as Donovan brutally kicked it open, his heavy boots forcefully entering the private sanctuary. Madeline forcefully pulled Leo entirely into the dark, silent shadows of the closet completely covering his small trembling mouth with her shaking hand, praying desperately to a God she hadn't spoken to in 5 long years for a miracle she did not deserve. The terrifying, heavy footsteps of the traitorous security chief echoed slowly and ominously throughout the massive, devastated master bedroom, the chilling sound completely amplifying the absolute suffocating terror tightly gripping Madeline's pounding heart. Hidden deep within the dark, suffocating confines of the expensive cedar closet, she held Leo so incredibly tightly against her chest that she could vividly feel the erratic, terrified fluttering of his tiny heartbeat violently syncing entirely with her own. The harsh, heavy breathing of the hunting mercenaries drifted menacingly through the slightly ajar closet door, accompanied by the terrifying, chaotic sounds of heavy furniture being violently overturned and beautiful, priceless glass lamps being ruthlessly smashed into a million glittering pieces. Come out wherever you are, little ghost." Donovan taunted cruelly, his dark, mocking voice dripping with sinister, sadistic pleasure as he slowly, methodically stalked across the luxurious room. "There is absolutely nowhere left for you to hide. The entire perimeter is completely ours. Dominic is currently trapped down in the city, probably bleeding out on a dirty speakeasy floor. You are completely, entirely alone." Madeline squeezed her eyes tightly shut completely, refusing to let the paralyzing, toxic venom of his cruel, lying words fully infect her racing mind. Dominic was not dead. She absolutely inherently knew it in the deepest, most primal core of her soul. The terrifying, undeniable monster she had witnessed briefly in that faded suburban diner was completely, unequivocally indestructible. He would simply not allow himself to die while they were in grave mortal danger. He had made a solemn, sacred vow. She just had to survive long enough. She just needed a few more precious, agonizing minutes. Suddenly, the heavy closet doors were violently ripped entirely off their metal tracks, completely flooding the dark, hidden sanctuary with blinding, harsh bedroom light. Madeline screamed forcefully, instantly throwing her body entirely over Leo to shield him completely from the terrifying threat. Donovan stood imposingly towering above them, the deadly suppressed muzzle of his heavy weapon pointed directly menacingly at Madeline's trembling head. "End of the line, lady," Donovan sneered coldly, reaching down aggressively with his large free hand to violently grab her fragile, terrified shoulder. Before his rough, calloused fingers could even graze the cheap fabric of her waitress uniform, a horrific, unnatural sound completely shattered the tense atmosphere of the penthouse. It was a terrifying, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated, demonic fury, echoing violently from the distant marble foyer. It was a terrifying sound that absolutely did not belong to a mere mortal human being. It belonged entirely to a monstrous, bloodthirsty apex predator that had just discovered its sacred, hidden den violently breached. Donovan completely froze, his confident, cruel smirk instantly vanishing from his scarred face, rapidly replaced by a sudden sickening wave of pure, undeniable dread. "What the hell was that?" one of the masked mercenaries nervously stammered, stepping cautiously backward toward the ruined, splintered doorway. The heavy, rhythmic, terrifyingly fast thud of enormous charging footsteps violently vibrated the sturdy floorboards beneath their boots. Dominic Moretti had officially arrived, and he had brought the entire devastating wrath of hell violently with him. The first masked mercenary cautiously stepped out into the long hallway, only to be instantly brutally met by a massive tailored blur of dark charcoal wool and sheer overwhelming kinetic violence. Dominic didn't even bother to slow down or forcefully raise his heavy weapon to fire a single shot. He aggressively lunged forward, violently tackling the heavily armed man directly through the thick glass of a massive, expensive display case. The sickening, horrific crunch of shattering bones violently, completely overpowered the loud, chaotic sound of breaking glass as Dominic brutally, mercilessly snapped the traitor's neck with his bare, bloodied hands. Donovan frantically raised his heavy submachine gun, desperately pointing the trembling barrel directly toward the hallway, his breathing suddenly ragged and incredibly shallow. "Shoot him! Shoot him now!" Donovan screamed frantically at his remaining terrified partner, but it was entirely hopelessly too late. Dominic stepped fully into the ruined, chaotic bedroom, his massive, imposing frame completely blocking the only available exit. He looked absolutely terrifyingly demonic. His expensive overcoat was heavily, dramatically stained with dark, fresh blood, none of it belonging to him. His terrifying, icy blue eyes were completely, violently black, entirely void of any human mercy or lingering compassion. He slowly locked his deadly gaze directly onto Donovan, completely ignoring the second mercenary who was frantically, desperately struggling to raise his heavy rifle. Without breaking eye contact with the traitorous chief, Dominic swiftly, smoothly raised his Glock 19 and fired a single, deafening, perfectly aimed shot. The second mercenary instantly dropped completely dead to the floor, a single perfectly clean bullet hole violently, completely penetrating his dark tactical mask. Donovan trembled violently, suddenly dropping his heavy, useless weapon to the floor and raising his hands in absolute, desperate surrender. "Boss? Boss, please wait. Carmine completely forced me. He forcefully threatened my family. I had absolutely no choice." "You always have a choice," Dominic whispered darkly, his voice dropping into a terrifying, deadly register that seemed to completely lower the temperature in the entire room. He slowly walked forward, holstering his weapon entirely. He absolutely did not want to merely shoot Donovan. He desperately wanted the traitor to deeply, intimately feel the terrifying, agonizing pain of betraying the syndicate. Dominic forcefully grabbed Donovan entirely by the thick tactical collar of his dark uniform, lifting the large, heavily muscled man entirely off the wooden floor with terrifying, effortless, superhuman strength. He violently slammed Donovan aggressively against the nearest solid wall, the forceful impact completely shattering the expensive plaster. Dominic's large, calloused, heavily scarred hands instantly closed violently around the traitor's thick throat completely, mercilessly crushing his windpipe in a lethal, unbreakable iron grip. Donovan desperately, frantically clawed at Dominic's massive arms, his eyes rolling completely back in absolute agony as the oxygen was violently, completely cut off. "You deeply frightened my son!" Dominic growled savagely directly into the dying man's ear, completely ignoring the desperate, weak struggles. "You deeply frightened my woman. For that unforgivable crime, your entire bloodline will officially cease to exist." With one final, brutal, sickening twist, Dominic violently ended the traitor's miserable life, letting the heavy, useless corpse forcefully drop entirely to the floor like a discarded, broken rag doll. The massive bedroom was finally completely silent, save for the heavy, ragged, adrenaline-fueled breathing of the terrifying mob boss. Dominic stood completely still for a moment, slowly allowing the violent demonic rage to gradually recede entirely from his pulsing veins. He slowly turned around his chest, heaving heavily, and completely softened his terrifying expression as he gently knelt directly down in front of the ruined, shattered closet. Madeline was sitting entirely on the floor, holding Leo incredibly tightly, her wide, tear-filled eyes completely, utterly terrified by the extreme, shocking brutality she had just tragically witnessed. Yet completely beneath the profound fear, there was an incredible, overwhelming wave of profound, undeniable relief. "Madeline," Dominic whispered softly, his voice trembling slightly with heavy, overwhelming emotion as he carefully reached out his bloody, bruised hands, violently shaking. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" Madeline shook her head slowly, hot tears freely spilling over her pale cheeks. "We are entirely safe. You perfectly saved us." Leo slowly peeked out from entirely behind his mother's trembling arms, his wide, innocent blue eyes curiously looking at the incredibly giant, terrifying man, completely covered in dark blood. He slowly held out his small, sticky hand, proudly showing the heavy, solid gold pocket watch entirely, completely safe and undamaged. "I kept it completely safe, Daddy," the brave little boy whispered softly. Dominic's hardened, ruthless heart completely, utterly broke into a million pieces. The terrifying, undisputed kingpin of the Chicago underworld completely collapsed forcefully to his knees amidst the blood and the broken, shattered glass. He violently pulled them both entirely into his massive protective arms, burying his face completely into Madeline's soft hair, sobbing loudly, entirely, unashamedly for the second time that dramatic, unforgettable day. He had aggressively fought through pure, unadulterated hell, violently conquering absolute betrayal and certain death, completely simply to hold his entire world together. The dark, bloody past was finally dead, and his fragile, newly found family was completely, eternally his to furiously protect. The aftermath of the violent massacre inside the Golden Penthouse was completely terrifying. Dominic gently lifted his beautiful little boy from the cold marble floor, holding him safely against his broad chest. Madeline walked closely beside them, her trembling hands firmly holding onto the torn sleeve of his heavy charcoal overcoat. They slowly stepped over the ruined debris of the broken sanctuary. The harsh reality of his dark world had finally violently collided with her quiet life, leaving absolutely nothing but destruction behind. Vincent quickly arrived exactly 10 minutes later, with heavily armed backup completely securing the breached building. He took one look at the tragic scene and understood the immense gravity of the situation. Rosa was gently carried away by medical staff, miraculously still breathing despite her terrible wounds. The brave housekeeper had survived the brutal attack, earning the absolute eternal gratitude. Dominic handed Leo over to Madeline and instructed Vincent to quickly take them to his highly fortified private estate on Lake Geneva. It was a sprawling, secluded compound, heavily guarded by men completely loyal only to him. No one else knew about this hidden fortress. "You were going to be completely safe there," Dominic whispered softly, pressing a gentle kiss against her pale forehead. "I have to finish cleaning up this terrible mess. Carmine must face the absolute final consequences of his ultimate treason." Madeline nodded slowly, holding her sleepy son closely. "Please come back to us, Dominic. Do not let the dark monster entirely consume you today." Dominic smiled warmly, his icy blue eyes showing genuine human emotion for the first time in many long years. "I am absolutely coming back. I finally have a real reason to truly live." As the armored vehicle safely drove his family away from the violent city, Dominic turned his full attention back to the grim task at hand. The underworld required a heavy, bloody toll to restore absolute order. He drove quickly back to the underground speakeasy where his traitorous uncle was still bleeding miserably on the hard wooden floor, heavily guarded by the loyal captains. Carmine looked up pathetically as Dominic confidently entered the smoky room. The arrogant older man had finally realized the complete failure of his grand deceptive scheme. His desperate play for ultimate power had entirely collapsed around him like a fragile house of cards. "Dominic," Carmine gasped painfully, clutching his ruined shoulder. "Have mercy. I am your family." Dominic stood directly over the pathetic man, his face an impenetrable mask of pure cold stone. "You completely destroyed my family 5 years ago," Dominic stated clearly. "You forced my innocent woman into hiding and stole the precious early years of my only son. You are no longer my blood." Dominic raised his heavy weapon and decisively ended the reign of Carmine Moretti with a single deafening shot. The remaining captains watched in absolute terrifying silence, perfectly understanding that the true king of Chicago had fully returned to his violent throne. The absolute brutal lesson was entirely clear. Betrayal would strictly be met with swift, uncompromising death. The syndicate was finally purged of its most toxic, poisonous element. Dominic slowly holstered his smoking weapon and turned to face the remaining men. "The old ways are entirely dead," he declared loudly, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Anyone who questions my absolute authority will join Carmine in the cold ground today. Do we have a clear understanding?" The captains nodded frantically, swearing absolute, unquestionable loyalty to their terrifying boss. Dominic walked out of the dark room, completely leaving the bloody mess behind him forever. He drove straight to the quiet shores of Lake Geneva. The raging storm had finally passed, completely replaced by a beautiful, calm dawn, breaking over the peaceful water. Madeline was sitting quietly on the spacious wooden deck of the heavily fortified estate, softly watching the bright sun rise over the gentle waves. Leo was sleeping soundly inside the massive, secure mansion, completely exhausted from the terrifying events of the previous day. She heard the soft crunch of heavy boots on the gravel pathway and turned around. Dominic walked slowly toward her, his expensive overcoat finally gone, wearing only a clean white shirt, completely free of dark stains. He looked incredibly exhausted, but the terrifying darkness that usually clouded his handsome face had completely vanished. He sat down gently beside her on the wooden bench, letting out a long, heavy sigh. "It is finally finished," Dominic whispered softly, looking out at the calm, glittering water. "Carmine is entirely gone. The dangerous syndicate is completely under my strict control. Nobody will ever dare to threaten you or our beautiful son again." Madeline reached out slowly, resting her warm hand perfectly over his bruised knuckles. "Are you absolutely sure?" she asked quietly, her bright eyes searching his exhausted face. "Can a ruthless mob boss ever truly escape the violent darkness?" Dominic turned his head, his icy blue eyes locking directly onto hers. "I will never completely escape my bloody past, Madeline," he admitted honestly. "But I will spend every single remaining day of my long life building a completely safe, bright future for you and Leo. You are my true kingdom now." He leaned forward slowly, completely closing the small distance between them, and pressed his warm lips against hers. It was a deeply passionate, desperate kiss, entirely filled with 5 years of agonizing sorrow, profound regret, and overwhelming, undeniable love. Madeline closed her eyes, completely, fully surrendering to the overwhelming wave of raw emotion. The terrifying, undisputed kingpin of the dark underworld had completely laid his heavy crown at her fragile feet. "We will need to establish new, very strict rules," Madeline whispered softly against his lips, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her beautiful face. "No more dangerous guns openly left inside the family house, and absolutely no more conducting violent mob business during the early hours of family dinner time." Dominic laughed softly, a beautifully rich, genuine sound that completely warmed the cool morning air. "Whatever you completely desire, my beautiful queen," he promised, sincerely wrapping his massive protective arms entirely around her slender waist. Your simple word is my absolute unquestionable law. The bright morning sun continued to rise steadily, completely, bathing the peaceful estate in a warm, golden glow. They sat together in absolute comfortable silence, simply watching the beautiful daylight fully chase away the lingering dark shadows. The terrible, frightening nightmare was officially over, and their brand new, unpredictable life was just miraculously beginning entirely anew. Inside the grand, sprawling mansion, Leo suddenly woke up happily clutching the heavy golden pocket watch tightly in his small hand. He smiled brightly, completely, knowing that his strong, brave father was standing securely right outside the sturdy doors. The scary, crying man from the faded diner had perfectly transformed into a fiercely loving, entirely devoted protector. Dominic suddenly heard the tiny, joyful footsteps quickly running down the long hallway. He stood up swiftly, catching his laughing son effortlessly in his broad arms. Madeline watched them happily, her heart completely full. They were a perfectly reunited, deeply bonded family. The dark, bloody streets of Chicago would forever whisper the terrifying legend of Dominic Moretti. But here, perfectly safely hidden away on the quiet shores of the peaceful lake, he was absolutely nothing more than a loving, devoted father and a fiercely loyal partner. He would completely rebuild his massive empire, entirely ensuring that the brutal, violent business of the underworld completely stayed entirely separate from his sacred, beautiful home. Madeline finally felt a deep, profound sense of lasting peace. She had bravely faced the terrifying darkness and miraculously brought the fierce, ruthless monster completely back into the bright light. The long, agonizing years of hiding bravely in the dreary suburbs were completely gone forever. She no longer needed to pretend to be a simple, invisible waitress named Madeline Hayes. She was officially Madeline Moretti, the undisputed, powerful queen of the Chicago Syndicate. Together, they would boldly forge a completely new, incredibly bright destiny. They would perfectly teach their brave son exactly how to navigate the complex world with deep compassion, unwavering strength, and absolute, unshakable honor. As they walked happily back inside the grand house, a vibrant, colorful rainbow miraculously appeared directly over the calm, beautifully glittering lake waters. The storm over Chicago finally cleared, leaving behind a rebuilt empire where family always comes first. Thank you so much for watching this thrilling mafia romance audio drama. If the intense journey of Dominic and Madeline through love, betrayal, and redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to show your support. Please kindly always share this incredible story with your friends who love suspenseful romance, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking, exciting tales. Your engagement helps us create more amazing content. Drop a quick comment below with your favorite